What can the political history of the past 200 years, from 1820 till 2020, tell us about the patterns of democracy and regime change? To answer this question, it is necessary to establish a broad narrative of defining democratic movements in this time period. The American political scientist Samuel Huntington provided a framework to this in his description of democratic waves over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. He described waves of democracy where over a period of time global democracy is strengthened and autocracies on the retreat, as well as reverse waves where democracy is weakened for a period of time, autocratic practices are normalized. He described the first wave as progressing throughout the 19th century, continuing until the eve of the Great Depression. The first reverse wave for the 20 years from 1922 until 1942. The second wave from 1943 until approximately 1960. The second wave from 1962 until 1975, and the third wave continuing from 1974 through to 1991, when he wrote the book. The first wave, starting with the introduction of universal suffrage among white males in the United States of America in 1928, and ending with the advent of democracy in Spain and Chile in the 1920s. It was characterized by democratization among the industrialized West, with human rights conceptualized in a Christian humanitarian sense. It was very much made in the image of Enlightenment ideals. The period of democracy is famously captured by the French prison inspector, Alexis de Tocqueville, in his seminal work, Democracy in America. In the 5 years in which he set off for the United States, travelled the country, returned to France, and published the first volume. France's political scene was not characterized by the somewhat quaint description of New England politics, instead by 2 bloody insurrections on the streets of Paris, with entrenched and unreconcilable societal divisions between at least 3 separate factions. Central to de Tocqueville's worldview is a very clear praise of those he considered to be unblemished, specifically the American Indians. He was also impressed with the established system of checks and balances on the power of the different branches of government. He also praises the transparency of American government and acknowledges the advantages with the freedom of the press. Even though de Tocqueville would not be described as a stalwart supporter of democracy, the specific civic institutions he identified in America are characteristic of those that were encouraged wherever democracy went in the first wave. More broadly, the democracies that emerged in the first wave drew much intellectual inspiration from a large number of thinkers and theorists, such as Locke, Bentham, Montesquieu, Rousseau, as well as the ideals of the French and American revolutions more broadly. Next, Huntington identified was the first reverse wave, as starting with a very specific event. That is when Benito Mussolini's black shirts marched on Rome over 3 days, culminating on Sunday, the 29th of October 1922. Well, the end date is more nebulously placed, with the apex of Axis power in the Second World War, sometime in 1942. This period of democratic retreat is characterized by movements with a very particular perception of the central group as having a central and unifying spirit of some sort. In practice, these nations were National Socialists, such as in Italy, clerical fascists, such as in Spain, Marxist-Leninists in Russia, or the unique Japanese fascism of Showa statism. The central link between these isms of that inane, almost supernatural link between people of a certain group is explained in terms of the global working class in the case of Russia, and the nation in regards to the other states. In Hitler's Mein Kampf, he describes his view of what really makes the spirit or the destiny of Germany. He writes that economics is only second or third-rate importance, and the primary role falls to the factors of politics, ethics, morality, and blood. In other words, Hitlerism is therefore built on the understanding and protection of what is the right politics, the right ethics, the right morality, and the right blood. Indeed, this perception is confirmed when he diagnoses to the reader what, in his estimation, went fundamentally wrong for the Germany in the First World War. He says that the loss of the First World War was not a cause, but a consequence of causes. Causes which he identifies as ethical and moral poisoning from the Jews and Marxists infighting. Here is the essence of what makes the first reverse wave autocracies so unique. Whereas, as will be described later, the Latin American juntas saw their role as a rationalizing intervention on the weak democratic leaders. The first reverse wave autocracy saw their role as something more akin to an Old Testament prophet, who sees rot in a nation's collective morality and therefore has a sacred duty to ensure that the nation is rid of such rot. In Germany, this rot was seen as the Jews. In Japan, this rot was seen as an abandonment of the sacred bond that existed between the emperor and his people since time immemorial. This bond was described by Elise Tippton as having the government as the parents, the people as the children, and the police the nursemaid. From this perception, the officials of early Showa Japan from 1926 until 1945 saw internal dissent as a mass cause of wanton disobedience, indeed moral rot, that is divinely ordained to be corrected by them, the police. In this way, the ideological underpinnings of Japan mirrored that of the other countries with the same signatures, all arriving at the conclusion in much different way. Following the first reverse wave comes the second wave of democratization. This wave, Huntington identified as starting in 1943, with the Allies, or United Nations, beginning to roll up the Axis forces globally, and specifically with the monarchist plot and coup d'etat of the 25th of July against Benito Mussolini. The second wave concluded sometime around 1960. This wave began with the establishment of democratic governments in the direct aftermath of the Second World War in places such as West Germany. This wave would perhaps be the most notable for establishing explicitly democratic institutions in a much more global manner than the first, and in much more uniformity than the third. This mainly occurred in former European colonies that, following their independence, adopted the democratic institutions of their former colonizers, as evidenced by the presidential republics in South Korea, across the former French colonies in West Africa, as well as parliamentary republics in Nigeria, South Africa, and formerly British Asia. Huntington also identifies the victory of the Allies over the Axis as promoting a more active and real expression of democracy in parts of the world that were nominal democracies, and has had long-standing democratic institutions, such as Greece, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and Colombia. On the whole, the second wave of democracy left in its wake a modest increase in the number of new democracies, or West Germanys, but it led the way for the coming large number of post-colonial autocracies to make the transition to full democracies, or something close to it, in the third wave of democratization. You can see in this graph now a very clear pattern in the absolute numbers of democracies, autocracies, and anocracies. Now, in the time of more easily measurable data, you see the visual evidence for the second wave, marked by a gentle increase in the number of democracies through the 50s, before plateauing in the 60s, while the number of autocracies increases precipitously through the 1960s and 70s, before peaking around 1975 with the transition into the third and most marked wave of democratization that carried until the end of the data in 2007. The types of autocracies that were birthed in the second reverse wave has a tendency to have a strong and powerful military, at least internally, as well as a mode of governance called bureaucratic authoritarianism. This mode remained prominent throughout the entire second reverse wave, which lasted from 1962, where the Peruvian military intervened to stop the election, to 1975, and the end of Francoist Spain. The genesis of bureaucratic authoritarianism comes as a solution to the problem of the so-called middle income trap that industrialized countries can find themselves, where the economy stagnates as the country's workforce is effectively too wealthy to exploit for large profit, but not wealthy enough to produce large profit without exploitation. Time and time again across Latin America, Africa, and East Asia, chief generals did not believe that their civil leaders would make economic decisions correctly, or bravely, or optimistically. When confronted with civil and political instability and corruption, also very common, the democratically elected leaders were seen by many to be inherently ineffective, unable to lead, and vulnerable to the traditional complaints from the army on the lack of discipline of civilians. In other words, these generals saw themselves as a martial solution to a 20th century problem, making tough decisions for the country that the civil leaders were not capable of making themselves. The purpose of providing the explanation of administrative authoritarianism, as well as the illiberalism of the first wave, is to clearly indicate that autocracy can and has been attractive and possible in industrialized countries. The third wave of democratization was primarily characterized by a strongly liberal reaction against the militarist regimes that largely emerged in the second reverse wave and the communist ones that emerged in both the first and the second reverse waves. The third wave has a nice and clean start date to it, that is the 24th of April 1974, when some officers in the Portuguese army toppled the autocratic corporatist Second Republic. The wave of democratic regime changes that started in Iberia lapped the world, first to Latin America in the late 1970s and early 80s, then to East Asia through the Philippines in 1986 and South Korea with their democratizing reforms of 1987. The movement then travelled back to Europe, where a number of nations in the Eastern Bloc began to liberalize and hold free elections. Beginning with Poland in 1989, then in 1990, East Germany, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. Although for Yugoslavia and most of the old Soviet republics, the process would take a number of years to complete. It was in this period of momentous change and great democratization that Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous, or perhaps infamous, article in the National Interest Journal, titled The End of History. He posed in it whether those at that time were witnessing not just the end of the Cold War, nor just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. His argument was that since democracy had weathered the fight against the two greatest ideological threats to it, the illiberal communism and fascism, then democracy and democratic practices were sure to last indefinitely, as long as there were no competitors left, and any new ideological competitor would have to challenge the already dominant global democratic order. On the other words, that if the reader would admit for a moment that the fascist and communist challenges to liberalism are dead, are there any ideological competitors left? As we can see from the graph, the period of democratization did not in fact continue indefinitely, and the high rate of change did not prove to be durable, despite modest increases in democracy through the 1990s and the decade of the 2000s. Indeed, at the beginning of the 2010s, most saw democracy healthier than ever, that they were living the most democratic time in history. When the Arab Spring took hold from 2010, many saw the movement as a vindication of Fukuyama's contention that the Islamic fundamentalist, autocratic, and monarchic institutions of that part of the world, the most stubborn to democracy, were not capable of withstanding forever. Larry Diamond picks up the assessment of the state of democracy in the modern day, assessing from 2019 that Fukuyama's immortal third wave of democracy has not come to pass, and in fact, Diamond contends that we are now living in the third reverse wave. Diamond identifies 4 characteristics of the world of 2019, indicating a reverse wave. He indicates that many democracies that had existed do not anymore, that many of those that still do are unstable and poor in quality. Authoritarian practices have proven to be remarkably adaptable to early 21st century technology and cultures, and that the traditional defenders and promoters of democracy are far more apathetic and less confident in doing so anymore. Diamond identified the beginning of the reverse wave as being in 2006, and has noted that in the 9 years since the Arab Spring started, out of the 17 countries that had protests, only Tunisia has enjoyed both stable and meaningful change in a democratic direction, a clear indication of a certain failure of democracy to assert itself. Democracy over the past 2 centuries has certainly advanced. Humanitarian aims have had a long history of eventual success, and democracies are no longer the exception. Despite this, there is nothing to indicate anything close to the extinction of authoritarianism.